the question is, how does the effect of methamphetamine being shipped in to Arkansas affecting the number of meth labs in Arkansas? So I've actually been studying this topic for a few years because the dynamics of how the number of labs and the amount of methamphetamine and trafficking is kind of interesting to me. There's a few things. I'm going to go ahead and back that up with a little bit of history first. First of all, Arkansas's got a couple of pipelines that go through it, 30 and 40, that to get to the eastern side of the United States, if you're trying to ship drugs from Mexico, you pretty much have to go through Arkansas, unless you want to go a whole lot further out of your way and go up through Kansas and hit, I think, is that 70 up there? So Arkansas gets a ton of large shipments of methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana, and we have large interdiction programs in Texarkana, in Fort Smith, in West Memphis, and then we just started one last year. The Pulaski County Sheriff's Office started one last year to cover the Pulaski County area where all the highways kind of come together. So there's a whole lot of 18-wheelers full of drugs that are getting shipped through, and we work tons of bulk cases every day. But this is kind of the way I'm seeing how the meth being imported in, number of meth labs, is affected. So in 2005, there was some pseudoephedrine legislation that went into effect. Before that, you could pretty much buy as much pseudoephedrine as you wanted, which is the primary precursor for manufacturing methamphetamine. If you don't have pseudoephedrine, you can't make methamphetamine. So if you can get a ton of precursor, then you can pretty much make as much of the drug as you want. They legislated that finally. The pharmaceutical lobby backed down a little, and we were able to make that law go into effect. At the very same time, the amount of ice, which is a very high purity of methamphetamine, was coming into Arkansas more than it ever had been before. There's a real close, inversely proportional correlation with the price of methamphetamine and the quality of methamphetamine, and it's all related on demand. So because there was so much high purity methamphetamine coming into Arkansas, the price plummeted, and there was really no reason to cook your own methamphetamine because you could buy it for so cheap coming in from California or Mexico. So Mexico decided to regulate pseudoephedrine, and they made it illegal to even bring pseudoephedrine into Mexico at all, which I'm told by some that know a whole lot more about it than me that's not being enforced as much as it should. However, we have seen a drop in the amount of methamphetamine coming to Arkansas that I think is directly proportional to that. So we've got the pseudoephedrine law that made the number of meth labs drop. We had the importation of ice coming into Arkansas really go up. So because of those two things, that's the reason why we think the number of meth labs dropped so much. There was a third thing that happened as well, which I think affects this kind of crime as much as anything. We had the Iraq War got really expensive, and they were making cuts across everything. Drug task forces across the United States got cut tremendously every year, starting around 2004 all the way up till last year. And there's, of course, a direct correlation with the amount of enforcement and the number of arrests. If you don't look for meth labs, you're not going to find meth labs. And that goes back with any crime. With methamphetamine investigations, every drug task force or any kind of law enforcement agency that has a narcotics unit, when they're investigating a drug case, they have to be able to make asset seizures to be able to perpetuate the funding it takes to continue to make more hand-to-hand buys and to buy the undercover cars and all the kind of stuff that's associated with narcotics investigations. And so if you can't arrest a guy that has a lot of cash or a lot of seizable goods that can be auctioned off, then you're going to have a hard time maintaining the funding for your law enforcement narcotics investigation unit. So oftentimes law enforcement is forced with a very difficult decision. Are we going to go and investigate a cocaine bust? Are we going to investigate a marijuana bust? Or are we going to investigate a meth bust? That's the three major things that are happening in Arkansas. And with cocaine and marijuana, there's always a lot of cash and a lot of cars present. But with methamphetamine labs, there's nothing worth taking because they've probably taken it apart. They have an extra 8 hours a day. They never sleep, and they're taking away their VCRs, and they're taking apart their cars, and they're high while they're doing it. And they think that they'll be able to put it back together again, but they never figure out how to get it all back together again. So there's just pieces of everything all over the houses. You wade through ankle deep in circuit boards and broken computer screens, and they'll have 6 cars on blocks in the backyard. And so So law enforcement knows this, and they know that they're not going to be able to get any cash out of a meth lab. So if you have to choose what kind of investigation you're going to do in a budget crisis situation, you're going to cut meth labs first. So if you don't look for meth labs, you don't find meth labs. If you don't have to cook meth because it's so cheap, then the number of meth labs is going to drop. So all three of those things had a direct relationship on why the number of meth labs was dropping. Funding has gone back up a little bit. Pseudoephedrine laws have gotten so that the cooks are getting pretty smart on how to get around all the legislation, and the price of meth has gone way up in the last few years. Probably a lot to do with the fact that Mexico's not making so much of it, so it's not as cheap coming into Arkansas. So with all these three things, we're seeing the number of meth labs increase, and it's all related to the availability of meth that's being imported into Arkansas. The more meth that comes in, then the less reason you have to cook it locally. Another thing that happened recently in the last few years is that the large organized crime units that sell a lot of the methamphetamine have learned how to cut the methamphetamine, how to adulterate it. They'll add other ingredients to it. They learned how to do it so well that it's hard to tell that it's even a lower purity without using it or having some instrument to calculate the purity of it. It's this stuff called ice. They would make it into crystals. It was pretty much marketing. They would just turn this methamphetamine. It's the same drug, no matter what it looks like. But they'd make it look real pretty, and people thought that it was a higher purity, so they'd be willing to pay more for it. Well, now they've learned how to make it look real pretty, and it still be a really low purity. So people have started to get wary of buying that pretty-looking ice because they know that it's probably cut down a whole lot, probably 30% or 40% at the most, whereas a few years ago it was around 80%. And so now they're telling their local cooks, I want to buy locally from you guys because I trust you more with the purity of the drug. And buying locally is not just a thing with produce. It's starting to happen with your drugs as well. And it sounds funny, but it's actually quite true.